Highland Park Jane Doe, also known as the Wayne County Jane Doe, identified as Mindy Clevidence. I covered this one over 2 years ago. It was actually one of the very first ones I chose to do. I'm not replaying the clip. My first microphone was terrible, and I talked entirely too fast. But I did want to use a little bit of a news clip that I broadcast in that video.
To get justice for Jane Doe.
She's one of hundreds of unidentified people in Michigan morgues tonight, most of them in Wayne County.
We've always thought of her as a kid.
As young as 15 or as old as 25. And according to the medical examiner's office, she could be biracial.
She was probably white and black.
Yeah.
She had her hair pulled back into a ponytail. She had very tight, curled hair, but it was brown with a reddish tint to it. She was about 5'3" and she was almost 200 pounds. No makeup and covered in freckles. She was really dressed like a 5-year-old would have been dressed. She had a giant white bow in her hair. She had this white skirt, a shirt with a bunch of smiley faces and lip prints all over it. She had a teddy bear watch. Maybe she was special needs. Maybe somebody else had her dressed that way.
There was something about this case that was so compelling and also just so sad. And the police did try. There was press coverage, and they did recreations. And because she was dressed distinctively and her jewelry was somewhat distinctive, there was quite a bit of hope that maybe someone would come forward and recognize her, but it just didn't happen. Despite the recreations, no one identified her, and genetic genealogy was the only option. And the credit in this case goes to Intermountain Forensics, who's had quite a few come out lately, leading to the identity of Mindy Clevidence. There was some speculation in this case that she could be special needs, and I've not seen anything proving or disproving that, or addressing it at all. Probably the biggest holdup in this case was that Mindy was not from where she was found. Instead, she had come from a group home in Ohio. Mindy's mother would tell Fox News 8 in Ohio that she had been sent to a group home when she was a junior in high school. She'd really been struggling at home, and the Dayton, Ohio group home was supposed to offer her some support that she'd been needing. Something I don't understand is that she left the group home and her family wasn't notified. Her family would only discover that she was gone when they mailed her a package, and the group home would call to say they couldn't give it to her because she wasn't there. They could get no answers as to what happened to her, so it would eventually take their lawyer talking to the sheriff before they would finally disclose that she went to Detroit, Michigan. It's not specifically stated, but my guess is that perhaps she told someone else in the group home where she was going. And this was the last on her whereabouts her family would ever hear, until she was finally identified. It would turn out that her family thought she was living her life out in the world and choosing not to contact them. And this is pretty frequent and normal, though I suppose there's a certain amount of hopeful thinking that goes along with all of this. Mindy's father would pass away in 2021 without ever knowing what happened to Mindy. I found his obituary and she's listed as surviving him. But even that was sort of a stark reminder of what had happened because they included where the other two siblings were living, and Mindy's name just sat alone. Mindy's mother, Paula, and her 2 sisters lived long enough to find out what happened to Mindy. It would turn out that one of Mindy's nieces would upload her DNA to a public database, and that changed everything. The niece was interested in finding out about her Irish ancestors, but she ended up finding so much more. Shortly after uploading it to the public database, Mindy's mom would get a call from one of her daughters, asking her to sit down and telling her what the DNA led to. Although not specifically stated, it appears that Mindy's case may have been one of those they were waiting on new DNA hits, because within just days she got a phone call. That call would come in from a detective in Highland Park, Michigan, requesting information about a close DNA match that happened. And this would, of course, bring up the fact that Mindy had also gone missing in Michigan. Subsequent DNA tests from her mother would confirm what they already believed that they knew. Mindy finally had her name back and was going to go home. Paula Clevidence, Mindy's mother, believes that God led her granddaughter to take the test and upload it, as this was just a spur-of-the-moment decision, and it was the final piece needed to give the family answers. Detectives have since personally delivered Mindy's ashes to Paula. The authorities have said that those in the home with her or others who knew her are desperately needed to come forward. So far, there's nothing to indicate at all how she ended up in that alleyway that fateful day. Police Chief James McMahon made this statement: "I want Mindy's family to know that our thoughts and prayers go out to them. We recognize that this is a very difficult time, and although it brings some closure, it also brings forth painful memories and unanswered questions." We do know that Mindy was born on October 15, 1978. It's stated that she showed sheep and market steers in a 4-H program. For anyone outside the U.S., it's an agricultural program for high school students. It involves agri-science and veterinary science, among others. They often breed and show animals. It's especially popular in rural counties. We also know that Mindy was involved in her local Baptist church. She's survived by her mother and 2 sisters. She has nieces and nephews that she didn't get a chance to know. They desperately need someone to come forward, even if it's anonymous. If you know anything, call the number on your screen. Mindy Clevidence went unidentified for 27 years. Had she lived the life she deserved, she would be 45 years old today. The Roane County Jane Doe, identified as Betty Lou Wisley. We begin here today in Roane County, Tennessee, near the town of Kingston on the 2600 block of Highway 58, beside a garbage dumpster. She had a number of clues as to who she was. For instance, she had a hysterectomy, breast implants, and a tracheotomy. There was a mole on the left side of her back, and it was clear she'd been the victim of a wound in her 3rd thoracic vertebrae, as well as a .22 lodged against her spine. But this was in a past event and not this one. In this specific event, her COD wasn't ever disclosed. They noted that she was a smoker with nicotine staining on her dentures. She had brown hair that had been dyed a red color and was likely 35 to 50. Whoever did this set her remains on fire. They released a sketch of what she may have looked like, but no one came forward. In 1987, there was so little that could be taken from her case to even try to identify her, but they did all that they could, eventually classified her as a Jane Doe. Her case would unfortunately sit and have to wait for technology to catch up. The fact that they can identify DNA after fire is pretty amazing, and at one point wasn't a given that it would ever even happen. But of course, Othram Labs has moved mountains when it comes to some of these previously impossible DNA cases. We know now that Betty Lou Wisley was born in 1935 in Clinton, Missouri. She was 51 years old when someone did this to her. She would have turned 52 later that year. There's not a whole lot released about her, other than the fact that she had been living in Knox County, Tennessee, when this happened. It is so important that anyone who knew her comes forward. Even tiny details could make all of the difference. Because, of course, getting her name is only half of the story. The person who did this shouldn't get away with it either. Betty Lou Wisley went unidentified for 36 years. Had she lived, she would be 88 years old today. The Eaton John Doe, originally referred to as Penny Doe, identified as Albert Allen Frost. In May of 1968 in Eaton, Ohio, there was a flood that occurred. That flood ended up washing out a shallow grave where remains were found. Bones were unfortunately scattered by the water, and the right forearm and hand would never be found, but they were able to collect pretty much all of the rest of the remains. And with this, the search began to find his name. But of course, in 1968, everything was different as far as how these John Does were handled, or even could be handled. There was no central place to list remains that were found, and of course DNA wasn't known. And unfortunately in this case, his COD wasn't even determinable, although they would say obviously the circumstances screamed foul play. They weren't even able to estimate how long he'd been there, although I can tell you now it was likely 5 years. Those in charge of the case would keep revisiting it, and they would exhume him in August of 2019 in order to formally start the path to identification. Unfortunately, the DNA process is often very long and tedious, and it would take more than 4 years until they finally got there in November of 2023. This time it was Moxie Forensics, along with the help of Intermountain Forensics, that would successfully manage the DNA typing. And it all paid off. And with this, Albert Allen Frost once again had his name. After 55 years of looking, the police finally determined that the man they were trying to identify was just 28 years old when he went missing in 1963. Albert had had some legal troubles along the way, and this included being arrested for larceny charges for a few items in Butler County. So when he went missing, it implied to some that he was just trying to get away. But he wasn't a bad guy, and we know he served his country in the military, and he was known to wear his military-issued army jacket everywhere. He, too, was proud of his service. And then he just suddenly disappeared in 1963, leaving his family feeling lost and not knowing what to do or even where to look. It's believed contact may have been in 64, but that he likely disappeared in 63. His family would say he was shy, and he sometimes disappeared in and out of their lives. So his going missing originally was a worry, but not completely unusual or unheard of either. But of course, as more and more time goes on, his nieces and nephews would now say that they were thankful to finally know what happened to their Uncle Albert. They would describe him as having dark hair and a small frame. They looked up to him and considered him a bit of a rebel. Albert Allen Frost was missing for 60 years, and an unidentified John Doe for 55. Had he lived, he would be 83 years old today. The Antwerp Jane Doe, 1992, sometimes referred to as the woman with the rose tattoo, identified as Rita Roberts. This one comes to us from Antwerp, Belgium, when on June 3, 1992, a woman was found pushed against a river grate. They knew she was light-skinned with dark hair, and she had what they described as a stout build. If they know what her COD was, they haven't stated it. However, there's no question somebody did this to her. Her case was solved as part of a program called Operation Identify Me, which seeks to get names for 22 women who perished in Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany over the last 50 years. In the end, it would be her tattoos that returned her name. It's easy to see how they would break the case now, in the digital age, in comparison with how and when this happened. Her tattoos, as seen here, were always seen as the greatest lead, the biggest chance of identification. And the tattoo on her arm is what ended up allowing her family to finally know what happened to her. The same month as the campaign to identify these women, the woman with the rose tattoo got more digital coverage online. That same month that this campaign started, the woman with the rose tattoo, her picture was flooded on the internet. And it was then that one of Rita Roberts' family members would see the picture and finally know. It had to be quite a shock. They would say that the knowledge of what had happened to her so long ago was staggering. The police would say they weren't surprised by what they called a terrible contradiction. I've never heard it worded that way, but it's true. They gave Rita back her name, and her family now knows what happened to her, but now they're suffering a loss all over again that had dulled over time. Interpol made the statement, she was a beautiful person who adored traveling. She loved her family, and she always wanted to have a family of her own. She had the ability to light up a room wherever she went, and she was the life and soul of the party. We hope that wherever she is now, she is at peace. We do know that she was from the same place where her life was taken. She disappeared in May of 1992, finally being identified in November of 2023. It would turn out she never left Antwerp. But her family, however, believed all along that she had. There was some sort of indication that she had moved to Cardiff, South Wales, in the UK. And in fact, they had gotten a postcard from her stamped at the location they believed her to be in, which I think is obviously very suspicious. So no one knows for sure if somebody else sent the card or she was back in Belgium. It doesn't appear there's any confirmation that Rita herself wrote the card. And in fact, it was that card that was why she wasn't reported missing. So it's entirely possible it served the intended purpose. Rita deserves more than this, though, and so does her family. So if anyone has any idea what happened or what Rita's life was like at that time, please call the number given. Her family said in closing, our passionate, loving, free-spirited sister was cruelly taken away. They would explain to those listening that it's been difficult to process, but they are grateful they have uncovered what happened to Rita. Rita Roberts went unidentified for 31 years. the exact number of years she spent on this earth. Had Rita lived the life she deserved, she would be 62 years old today. The Boynton Beach John Doe, also known as the Maritime John Doe, identified as Donald Kirk. We begin here today in September of 2003, when in Florida some fishermen were out on the water when they discovered the remains of a person about 5 miles east of the Boynton Beach Inlet, and this was near Boynton Beach, Florida. The person was found on the edge near some weeds, and it was determined he was between 65 and 75 and around 6'1" or 176 pounds, or 185 centimeters and 80 kilograms. His hair was a brownish red color, and they believed his eyes were hazel. He had a healed 12-inch scar on the center of both his stomach and another on his back. Near the scar on his stomach was an additional 3-inch scar. He had a few tattoos, but they were older and not very clear. It's believed that one is related to the Navy and that he may have served. There also looked to be an eagle with an anchor and the letters USN or USM. I blurred the tattoos because I don't show postmortems. I go back and forth, though, with the tattoos sometimes. Sometimes they're listed as postmortems and other times not. Often I can isolate them, but with older tattoos, it's not easy. After my monetization was taken away, I'm super paranoid now, too. So if you want to see the tattoos, just Google them, please. I'm so sorry. The police would determine he unalived himself. I'm not even sure exactly how they came to that conclusion. Othram Labs, which is located in Woodlands, Texas, used forensic-grade genome sequencing, and they arrived at his DNA and his name. Donald Kirk was 76 years old when he went missing from Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And this would turn out to be the same month that he was found in Boynton Beach. They knew the man had boarded a cruise and gambling boat in Fort Lauderdale, and he had made the decision to purposely jump overboard. The two towns are actually only about 30 miles or 48 kilometers apart, so he was pretty close to home all along. And the weird thing is, too, we know that Donald was reported missing. The sheriff's office said that the investigators looked into Kirk's background and discovered that he traveled to Fort Lauderdale in 2003 when he boarded that boat. If you're feeling hopeless in the U.S., you can dial 988. There's no shame in seeking help. Donald Kirk went unidentified for 20 years. If he were still alive, he would be 96 years old today. The Fairhaven John Doe, identified as Keith Olson. This one begins in Fairhaven, Massachusetts on April 8, 1985. It was then that a driver traveling on Interstate 195 who would make a discovery that was likely the difference between a man getting back his name or not ever being found. Discoveries like this from long patches of highway where people generally don't get out of their cars, as odd as it sounds to say they're lucky, in this case, it probably really was. Because as this driver got out of their car, they happened to catch a human skeleton about 45 feet from the roadway. He traveled into town, found a phone, and called the police. Those remains would be forwarded on to the FBI lab in Washington, D.C. They would conclude that he was a white man who'd had his life taken a few years before he was found. If I could lean into the luck of this just a little bit again for just a moment, he wasn't scattered. And because so much was left intact, they found what they described as trauma, and it was determined that someone had done this to him. Another article describes what was found as several spent projectives. They did a facial reconstruction, and they placed him likely in his 30s to 40s, and they even found some remnants of clothing. The reconstruction was done on the local news, and they did get some tips, but nothing ever panned out. Additionally, they pulled dental records from all around the area, but there was no match. But this always goes back to the whole touchy thing about comparing it with records of those who've been reported missing. And those are the only dental charts that they compared. But you had a system in place that often didn't allow you to report someone missing. Any missing adult, without proof of something else having happened, chose to walk away. And so that really tips the balance against a lot of the does being identified too, because now so much time has passed and some even were reported missing, and over time those records were lost. So as far as our databases now, there's a problem also. So the police did what they could to try to identify our John Doe here, but with little to go on, it eventually just turned cold, and that was pretty much it. That is, until the Bristol County District Attorney would go ahead and launch the Unidentified Bodies Project. This would lead to them enlisting Othram Labs, who was able to generate his DNA, eventually landing on a family tree for a missing man from Cranston, Rhode Island. Cranston is about 35 miles or 56 kilometers away from where he was found in Fairhaven, Massachusetts. So it was pretty close. We know now that Keith Olson disappeared 4 years earlier in April of 1981. Keith had been dating a woman who had previously dated a man who had ties to the mafia. Keith was seen leaving his home with 2 unidentified men the night he vanished, and that was it. There was no word from him again. His family long believed that Keith's life was taken, and it had to do with his girlfriend's ex-boyfriend. His family had come to the sad conclusion that Keith would never be found. And of course he almost wasn't, if not for the eagle eye of a passerby. His family would lovingly describe Keith as being protective and loyal, a man who has gone too soon, saying that he has never, even for a moment, left their hearts and minds. His being found and identified means so much to them, and that they would forever love him. They made this statement: "They have brought Keith's remains home to us so that he may finally be laid to rest, and finally have the peace that he deserves. No family should ever have to endure this long and painful anguish of not knowing what happened to their son or their brother, their Keith." Keith Olson went unidentified for 38 years, 11 years longer than he got to spend on this earth. Had he been allowed to live the life he should have, he would be 65 years old today. The Sedgwick County John Doe, identified as Harold James Crawford. This story begins on October 29, 1994, in Sedgwick County, Kansas, which is in the rural part of a county that includes the town of Wichita. This county has about 500,000 people in it. So while this was rural, it was still a pretty populated area. In this case, KG&E workers were out doing routine service at an intersection near 47th Street South and Hoover. And this area is not highly populated at all. It was here that they found remains of a man who had likely been there 6 months or longer. He'd been wrapped up in what is described as debris. They thought he probably wasn't very old, maybe 22 to 29, and around 5'8" and 160 pounds, or 173 centimeters and 73 kilograms. His hair was somewhere between auburn brown to a sandy blonde. He had teeth that were nearly perfect, other than a front tooth that had been pulled at a young age. He had no cavities or dental work at all. He was wearing khaki shorts and a purple Bugle Boy long-sleeved shirt. He was wrapped in blankets, a waterbed pad, and some sheets. There were other towels and sheets found nearby. Recreations were done and run on the news in hopes of identifying the man, but no matter what they did, the Sedgwick County Sheriff would find themselves at a point after multiple tries and reconstructions where all that was left to do was apply for a grant to take advantage of genetic genealogy. And this is where Othram Labs, once again, comes in. This eventually led to the name of a man missing from the same general area, Harold James Crawford, who was only 21 years old when he went missing from Wichita, Kansas. I manipulated this photo a little bit, but with full disclosure, it's pretty obviously an arrest photo. James was younger here, I think, and just from the look on his face, it seems like James was struggling. He was reported missing, but someone brought information forward saying he left of his own accord, and that missing person report was vacated, which may have very well kept him from being identified. His family missed him. His sister was a mom with 3 young kids at the time, and even remembered seeing the sketch shown on TV. She said she considered that the sketch looked a lot like her brother, but dismissed it, because the man in the photo was too old to be James, saying the resemblance was enough that it did make her think for a moment, and then of course remember it now. And unfortunately now she says she would forever be sorry for dismissing it as impossible. But the truth is, it's not her fault. Everybody just did the best that they could. And it's pretty common in a lot of these cases. Usually people don't jump to the idea that something permanent had happened. His sister would describe James as cool, saying her heart is broken. She had long believed he had moved on and was married somewhere, and it's shocking to find out he was gone all of that time. She said she looked for him on and off all of these years. And somebody had actually told her that James was married and sick of his dysfunctional family. I do wish I knew who said that, but it's not been given. But the story he left of his own accord, the story he was married, it spread through town and she believed it, and she thought she was respecting his wishes by giving him space. His COD has never been released. However, it's clear this was not an accident. So they need someone to come forward, and James's sister is desperate to find answers, saying she needs to know who did this. How someone could roll him up in a blanket and throw him in the dirt is unfathomable to her. He was 21 and living on the east side of Wichita. I've provided the number for Crime Stoppers. Anyone with any information can do this without giving their name. James Crawford went unidentified for 29 years. Had he lived, he would be 50 years old today. The Buffalo Jane Doe, 1988, identified as Sonya Yvette Archie. This story begins on March 25, 1989, in Buffalo, New York, where skeletal remains were found of a woman who was probably around 20 to 25 years old, possibly white or Hispanic, and she may have been Native American or Alaskan Native. She was around 100 pounds and 5'2", or 45 kilograms and 158 centimeters. Some pretty different recreations were done, but in reality, they were as different from each other as the woman they were meant to depict. She had been wearing a light blue and gray top in a size small, as well as a cotton and polyester sweatsuit. She also had on white thermal underwear, and they knew she had dark, curly, shoulder-length brown hair. So now they need to know more about her life. Sonya Yvette Archie was just 26 years old, a black woman who was from Buffalo, New York. She was found in the same city she went missing about 7 months later. It's likely the guess about her race is the reason that Sonya went unidentified for so many years. Although I feel like I should say, it's pretty amazing that the majority of the time, they do get the race correct. It just depends on a number of factors, and I imagine the knowledge and ability of an anthropologist if available. Sonya's COD hasn't been released, but they do know it was foul play. So anyone with information is needed to call. Sonya Yvette Archie went unidentified for 34 years. Had she lived the life she deserved, she would be 60 years old today. The Colorado County Jane Doe, identified as Isolde Yockey. This case begins on July 17, 1976, in Colorado County, Texas. It was here our Jane Doe was found, leading to an emergency call going out to the Colorado Sheriff's Office. This was near Sheridan, Texas, which is between Houston and San Antonio. She was found near Sandy Creek, which is located on Shell Plant Road in Sheridan, Texas. They would determine she had been where she was found for up to a year, which always makes identification that much harder when dealing with skeletal remains, but they could tell her skull had some sort of damage, although they weren't even able to tell for sure if it was pre or post-mortem. They did, however, follow all of the leads that they had, but unfortunately those were pretty few and far between. The investigation would hit an even bigger brick wall when it was discovered that the cold case was located in a jail basement storage room. They had gone to pull the file to try to figure out who this person was, and the problem is that storage room had flooded. So this affected pretty much everything about the case. The records were gone, and they didn't know what her COD was. In fact, the county had no idea her case even existed because the records were gone. They only found out when they got a letter from Harris County Medical Examiner in 2003 requesting the rights to finally bury her remains. So they would open up a brand new case file and request assistance from the Texas Rangers. In Texas, the Rangers offer their services to states when needed. They would eventually transfer the remains to the University of North Texas Forensic Anthropology. In 2007, they tried to identify her by her dental records. And because they didn't really have any idea where to start with her case, detectives would take to pulling old newspaper articles in hopes of finding something that would relate to her case. Her DNA was done and put into the DNA index system, which operates local, state, and national databases. As I've mentioned before, NamUs is part of this system, and it handles the DNA collections to families. And I learned from a subscriber who messaged me that they had been charging people for this service, and I didn't know that. and I've been encouraging anyone missing family members to go to NamUs and submit their DNA. However, this has now changed. They are no longer charging families. So hopefully NamUs will get more submissions and matches will be found easier. The other option they have is to pay a lot more and do the DNA that is suitable for genetic genealogy. But either way, there was no match in the system at this point. So the next step is always DNA suitable for genetic genealogy, which of course costs a lot more. The weird thing about this is we know that the Charlie Project listed Isolde as missing as of 2004, so she likely was in NamUs as an unidentified doe and as a missing person. So hopefully now they'll be able to collect more and more DNA samples. What actually happened with this one is that in April of 2024, her sister attended a missing person event. And this event was taking samples from people in hopes of making an identification. It's the easiest, cheapest, and fastest way to make a match. Her family would find out she wasn't far from home at all, but just far enough that her family wasn't aware that the Jane Doe about an hour and a half away from her home was a family member they'd been looking for all that time. She went missing from Houston, Texas, and was found in Colorado County, which is 79 miles or 127 kilometers away. She was last seen in Houston on August 1st, 1975. Her sister would say that she and her mother had been looking for her ever since Christmas of 1975, which was about 4 months after she went missing. The missing person report was filed in Harris County, but all along they had believed she moved and left willingly, and it's likely she ended up in Colorado County of her own free will. She was just 30 when she disappeared. She was the oldest of 2 daughters born to a political philosopher and his mathematics teacher wife. There are questions as to whether this is even foul play. Her sister would describe their dad as a risk-taker and adventurer, and she wondered if perhaps it wore off on his daughter. The family didn't expect to see her until Christmas of 1975, so that's why that was the reporting point. She was just 30 and she'd never missed Christmas. So when she didn't show up or call, and they couldn't get a hold of her, they were extremely alarmed, understandably so. By that time, her father unfortunately wasn't alive any longer. He had passed in 1960 at the age of 43. So it was just her mom and sister who were left. The police have limited information so far. I'm sure a lot of that's because the file was accidentally destroyed, but they do need more information to get justice for her. The Houston police are running this case, but I've included the number for the Colorado County Crime Stoppers, and you can call there anonymously. Isolde was an unidentified Jane Doe for 47 years. Had she lived the life she deserved, she would be 79 years old today. The Laguna Hills John Doe, identified as Michael Ray Schlicht. On September 14, 1974, 2 men were off-roading on a fire road in Laguna Hills, California. Off to the side of the trail that they were traveling on, they would discover a man who hadn't been there all that long, maybe 3 to 5 days. It was determined it was likely due to an accidental overdose of diazepam and alcohol. Diazepam is a benzodiazepine, and it's more commonly known under the name of Valium. It's used for anxiety, seizures, and muscle spasms. The man had blonde hair and had had some restorative dental work. They noted he was wearing a 10.5 size shoe, and he had no clothing on. The strange thing about his COD is it's listed as accidental in a lot of places that I looked. However, there are also others that say it was originally believed to be accidental, and now that is not the presumption. In this case, our John Doe eventually was tied to Randy Kraft, or at least in some articles this is. That's the hard thing about these, you only know what was printed, and it's not always consistent from article to article, and of course, who knows how accurate it is in the first place. If Kraft was indeed involved, he was known as the scorecard. He was responsible for 16 young men in the age group of our John Doe, or even younger. In this case, they knew he was around legal age, if not quite there. It's believed that Kraft is responsible for acts of SA against as many as 60 young men, innocent men, who had barely started out their lives, if even at all. I'm not sure how tenuous the link is between Kraft and our Doe, but in some of the articles it's listed as fact. I don't know. I like to tell you if things clash, and this one is kind of a mess. I will say, though, in this case, an OD alone isn't the method that Kraft used. Although Kraft was known to have lorazepam at his feet in a car. And of course, the fact that our Doe had no clothing on does make me wonder. That's not the usual way someone would accidentally pass. But I guess you never know. It's noted that 6 years after our John Doe was found, his case would be closed. And it would turn out that there were numerous young men in that area classified as losing their lives due to foul play. They were all within a several-mile radius from where our John Doe was found. It does sort of bring up the question, too, of how many people classified as a natural or accidental COD when it's not true. Obviously, all the authorities can do in these cases is the best they can do. It does seem that there may be a compelling case for Kraft being to blame. Kraft is actually still alive and being housed in San Quentin. Othram Labs would process the DNA of our John Doe through roads to justice. They eventually were able to identify possible grandparents to our Doe, and this would eventually lead to a granddaughter of that couple, who in turn would donate her DNA because she had not seen her brother since April of 1974. His age is shown on the screen right now. It would turn out that Michael Ray Schlicht was very far from home. He actually went missing from Cedar Rapids, Iowa in April of 1974 and was found in September of 1974 in Laguna Hills, California. This is, of course, 1,814 miles or 2,919 kilometers from home. It was far away. Michael was only the age that's shown on the screen now. From what I can gather from limited information, it appears there was a 7-month gap between him leaving home and his life being taken. This makes me personally think maybe he ran away, but that's just my own conclusion. It doesn't say so anywhere. So much more needs to be discussed in order to get to who did this for sure, so anyone with information on his travels is asked to call the number on the screen. Michael went unidentified for 49 years, nearly 3 times the amount he spent on this earth. Had he lived the life he deserved, he would be 66 years old today. The San Diego Jane Doe, also known as Bag Lady Doe, identified as Elaine Rose Armstrong. This one begins 42 years ago in San Diego, California, on October 16, 1981. A woman described as a local transient was found behind Vic's office supply at 1753 Garnet Avenue in San Diego, California. The woman was well known to people in the neighborhood. Because of this, they would give her the nickname Bag Lady Doe, which I have to admit I do not like. I feel like I have to say it because it's on here, but it seems pretty insulting to me. And that said, while this sounds insulting, she was so much more than that to them too. She was considered a neighborhood fixture. But while they knew her by sight, they didn't know her name. She had brown hair, dentures, a print head scarf, a wool jacket, a blue shirt, and a windbreaker. Her COD was brutal. I'm trying to think of a way to say it without tanking the video. And of course, with my little foray into demonetization, also don't want to mess anything up. You can see on screen now in an article that I'm showing, and she was unclothed from the waist down. If you're just listening and you can't see what's on the screen, I will say that she was pierced with something and suffered blunt force. I hate dancing around this so bad. I feel like she deserves more respect than that. The whole thing is evil. I can't imagine an elderly woman trying to make it living outside, and then this was done too, ending up wiping a name for nearly 4 decades. Her purse was found nearby, and the person who did this burnt the purse on purpose. There was an ID inside, but it was burnt to the point that it couldn't be read. Othram Labs, at the direction of the San Diego District Attorney, performed their usual magic, and they discovered our Jane Doe was a 51-year-old woman from Kalamazoo, Michigan, and she was named Elaine Rose Armstrong. She had been born in 1930. I wish I knew more of who she was or how she ended up living where she did. I do know that they have begun the process of trying to get DNA from clothing that was found with her in order to help identify the perpetrator. So they are trying to find out who did this. The unfortunate reality, of course, is that after 4 decades, the likelihood the person who did this to her is even still alive is maybe not great. Even if they beat the odds to find him, that person would have been able to live their life for decades and decades without paying. It's just incredibly unfair. I almost said maybe they could find the reason, but what reason could there be? There's no valid reason. But it is important that anybody with any information about this case call the sheriff at the number located on the screen or Crime Stoppers at 888-580-8477. Elaine Rose Armstrong was unidentified for 42 years. She was found 2,218 miles or 3,570 kilometers from where she was last known to live. Had she lived, she would be 93 years old today. Sahara Sue, identified as Gwenn Story. This is one of those identifications that so many of us have really been waiting for to happen. Some of the cases just touch us in a spot that others don't. Maybe there's no rhyme or reason why, but she is one of the more well-known cases, and she was actually one of the first episodes I ever did on this channel. The story begins on August 14th, 1979, and this was when the remains of a woman found in a field near the intersection of Las Vegas Boulevard South and Sahara Avenue in Las Vegas, Nevada. Because of her name, I always believed she'd been found by the Sahara Casino, to be honest, and I assume others probably feel the same, but she was actually found on Sahara Avenue, north of the Las Vegas Strip. This was in an open field by the Silverbird Hotel and Casino, which was sold and reopened 3 years after she was found. It would eventually reopen as the El Rancho Casino. For anyone who hasn't been to Las Vegas, that area of Vegas in and around the Strip probably paints a picture of tons of people walking close together, even though the casinos are pretty far apart. Often there's stores along the walkways even, and people milling in and out of those. But while that's true for some of the Strip, it's not true for all of the Strip. And I would say especially not on the north end of the Las Vegas Strip where she was found. This end, as far as my own experience, it's pretty vacant as far as foot traffic. We stayed at the Riviera 3 times actually, going for my husband's teaching conference. While he was in class, I'd walk around and like to people watch, and there was only so much you could do in this area, especially as it moved farther out, as she was found farther north. Vegas changes really quickly. The Stardust and Riviera, for instance, they're gone. And while it looks different, the location is still pretty sparse by comparison. Also, at least in my experience, people approach tourists for money in that area of the Strip. It's the only time I've been asked, I think. Not that people aren't panhandling in other places, but I'm talking coming up and bothering you. That's the only area of town I ever felt a little bit afraid. So she was found in the field around 9 p.m. by someone who was walking nearby. It's believed it's most likely that she passed 3 to 4 hours earlier, which if accurate means it was daylight when someone stabbed her with a knife. She had unfortunately been doing some serious drinking that day, and she had a blood alcohol level of 0.238, which is extremely high. When investigating this case, I saw an analysis that would suggest that this would equal 10 alcoholic drinks in a 2.5-hour time period. She was also very thin for her height. She was 5'6" or 168 centimeters and only 100 pounds or 45 kilograms. And she was probably no match for whoever did this to her due to her inebriated state, and there weren't any signs that she fought back. There were also no signs of SA, although she is described as being partially unclothed when found. So possibly someone took a souvenir or the perpetrator was interrupted. She did have on Levi's and a bluish-green button-up linen shirt that had a tie-up bottom and red floral embroidery with sequins. It's an image many of us have seen many times on the Jane Doe posters. She had wavy hair and her toenails were painted red. One of the most surprising details is that she had no teeth, which even given the time this was when she passed, in 1979, even that wasn't common. It was unusual for her age. And she was found with dentures on the top, but there were none on the bottom. She had jewelry that she was still wearing, 2 gold necklaces, one with a turquoise stone, and another with a clear plastic heart. They believed her clothing that remained had been purchased in Florida, leaving them to believe she probably wasn't from Las Vegas. But Vegas also is so different from any other area in the U.S. In 1979, nearly 12 million people visited Las Vegas from all over the world, and that number today is 42 million. She was wearing no shoes, but they may not have been taken. Her feet indicated she'd been walking around Las Vegas barefoot quite a bit. I can't imagine this was on purpose. She was found in August, and I've actually been in Vegas in August myself, and it was 119 degrees, which would be 48 Celsius. Now, obviously, it's not always like this, but Vegas is a desert and it gets super hot. So it makes me wonder if she had shoes. I don't know. No one really knows what her situation was at the time. It's possible she was in that field because she couldn't be walking around until the sun started to set. Even on the less brutally hot days there, it's usually in the high 90s or around 37 degrees Celsius. Her case is one of those that's tugged at the community heart, as well as many of us here at home. Multiple recreations were done and released in hopes they would find her name. Vegas is a different beast, though. A lot of people run away and end up there, and females are especially at risk as they're the main group that is taken advantage of. Her case would make the local news, and someone would come forward to say that they saw her with another man at the liquor store just hours before her death. He was actively being sought as a suspect. They placed him as being in his late 20s at the age of 28, was given as a guess at the time. If that age was correct, the suspect would be born in 1951. That would make him 72 years old right now. At the time, he had brown hair and a brown mustache, and he was around 5'11" and 165 pounds, or 180 centimeters and 75 kilograms. I don't show postmortem photos, but you can find them online if anyone is interested. In 2016, a lead would come forward saying they believed she lived in a trailer park in the area and was using the name of Shauna. They also said they believed she worked at a Holiday Inn or a motel on Las Vegas Boulevard. Now, we already know her name was Gwenn and not Shauna. Let me know what you guys think. I'm not sure why the shoe thing bothers me so much, but given the time of year, it just makes me wonder if she was running around that way if she had shoes, which would make it less likely she was working somewhere, even under a fake name. But given the temperatures, I just can't help but wonder. They did do a pollen isotope test, and they're inaccurate sometimes, but they believe she lived in Napa Valley or Central Valley, California before she was found, and as I mentioned, they believed her clothing came from Florida. Thanks to genetic genealogy and Othram Labs, we now know a little bit more, but there's still more to be learned. Gwenn Story was from Cincinnati, Ohio, not California or Florida as they speculated, and she was just 19. There's virtually nothing that came out as I record this. Because her case was so well known, I had hoped to offer more, but with maybe some more time, more will come out. We know that she left home without telling her family, and that she was with two men in the summer of 1979. She had left on a quest to find her biological father. The names of her travel companions, however, have been lost over time. At most, she could have been in Vegas for a few months. She hadn't been missing very long. We don't know when those two men reappeared, but her family did see them again in Cincinnati, and Gwenn was nowhere to be found. They would tell the family that she didn't want to leave, and they left her in Vegas. The police desperately need their names and to speak to them. Crime Stoppers allows anonymous reporting at 702-385-5555. Gwenn Story went unidentified for 44 years. She was found 1,964 miles, or 3,160 kilometers from home. Had she lived, she would be 63 years old today. I want to thank all of you for your consistent watching and comments. Whether writing something or leaving an emoji, it all pushes the channel to get suggested to new people. And I appreciate that so much. Take care of yourselves and each other.